Hello, everyone, and greetings from beautiful coastal Orange County. I'm in Huntington Beach, California. I'm Bruce Garner, and I'm just absolutely delighted to open the Bible with you and tell you about a journey I've been on for the last several years. But the story that led to what I'm going to present to you starts actually much longer ago than that. Before I was 30 years old, I had 3 different illnesses related to exhaustion. I was really just doing too much. I was in seminary. I was presumably working full time at this church as a staff member, and I had shingles, mononucleosis, and my jaw wouldn't stop cracking because I had been gritting my teeth so hard for so long without realizing it. I was developing problems that actually stuck with me for quite some time. I was not yet 30 years old, and as a young associate pastor, I was already burning out. The strain was starting to show in every single area of my life. And what's worse, as I matured in ministry, or presumably matured, I should say, as I stuck in ministry, as I kept getting a paycheck in ministry, I started noticing that people I had gone to Bible college and people I was in seminary with were already falling and going by the wayside. They were burning out, sometimes catastrophically, morally, sinfully failing as pastors. I'm a third generation BBF minister. My grandfather was the first saved on our side of the family. He was a BBF preacher. My dad and mom remained missionaries in Mexico, and I've been in this fellowship literally from birth. And in all of that time, I've noticed the same thing that you've noticed. Our ranks are thinning, and people we once looked to, rightfully, as mentors and heroes and trailblazers have gone by the wayside. Many of them are still on the job, but they're embittered. They seem to have a distant relationship with God, and they can no longer stand the sight of people. The quiet jokes, the dark cynicism, it shows in so many different ways as a pastor begins to fail. And now, after 30 years in vocational ministry, I'm ready to share with you something that God began to do in earnest in my life several years ago. I became interested in why so many of these pastors and missionaries finished well and why so many more fell along the wayside. Some of them even abandoned the faith. Others fell into sexual immorality. Some were caught in financial impropriety, and a vast unknown number, a number known only to God, stayed on the job, kept cashing the check, but were no longer effective as pastors. They were employed, but they were no longer effective. So several years ago, I decided to go back to seminary and pursue doctoral studies with a focus to learning what makes a pastor resilient. What are the things that are under our control? God is sovereign and he can do as he pleases. But what are the things that are under our control that will help us, finish well? After 2 years of research, I've discovered what I believe are 6 rock-solid, research-based, no argument about it, traits of resilience. Here they are. Resilient pastors keep 6 things in view. Their calling and preparation. They have continuous spiritual growth. They take good care of themselves. They cultivate and practice emotional health. They maintain and fight for their marriage and their family health. And they develop over the course of their ministry skill and find a good fit in their leadership. All 6 of those things are necessary for someone over the course of decades to serve Christ Church well and to finish well. If you just want a sprint, you can ignore some of these things. If you want to have a comet-like, a meteor-like ministry where you are highly effective and fruitful for 1 or 2 years, one of these things or many of these things can be safely ignored. But if you want to endure for a lifetime, if you want to remain effective and avoid burnout and, what's worse, catastrophic sinful moral failure, you have to cultivate these 6 dimensions. I don't have time, and you wouldn't want me at any point probably to share with you everything that I've learned, though the book that resulted from this research, Lord willing, will soon be published. But today I'd just like to share with you, just skim a few concepts off and tell you 3 things that resilient pastors know. The first is this. Resilient pastors know that their lives are like an inflatable raft, and a single breach can sink them. I want to remind you of those 6 elements again. A resilient pastor has a solid call from God and an initial and continuing preparation. He is continually growing spiritually. He is, for a lifetime, taking care of himself. He is practicing and improving and defending his mental health, his marriage and his family health, and his leadership skill and fit. If any one of those things is ignored, the man's whole life can sink. His entire ministry can be destroyed, or, and we've seen this so many times, you can probably think of the names. Maybe you're in the throes of this fight right now. The ministry itself can look good. The church may be thriving, but your family is cold and distant. Your children resent the fact that you're a pastor. Or maybe your family is healthy and the church is going well, but your own health is failing, as mine did before I was 30 years old, as absurd as that sounds. In this case, resilience, a resilient pastor has a whole life integrity. He is not content for public success alone. He wants to be respected and loved at home just as much as he wants to be respected and loved and followed by the people in his pew. He views his life again as an inflatable life raft, and he protects the entire thing. He looks after his entire life. What does fragility look like in this case? I've certainly practiced this. Maybe you have too. Fragility looks like compartmentalization. In other words, because it's so unpleasant, because it's so difficult, because the point of failure is somewhere outside the church, perhaps a difficult marriage, you ignore that, you put that aside, you invest yourself fully into preaching and pastoring, and your marriage slowly dies. Several years ago, I started volunteering as a law enforcement chaplain, and everybody knows that for military and first responders, it is not uncommon to be a hero on the job and to lose your family at home. Adultery and divorce rates are epidemic. They're famous among firefighters, police officers, and soldiers. They are famous for multiple marriages. Why is that? Because the man or the woman can remain highly effective and skilled on the job. When the uniform goes on, when the body armor is worn, all is well. A high degree of expertise, skill, and competence is displayed on the street. But things are not well at home. As pastors, we simply cannot afford that. We need to be able to be the kind of people who say with Paul in the book of Philippians these words. Here's the measurement of integrity in the whole life. At the end of his thank you letter of Philippians, Paul wrote, "What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you." Paul is drawing them not only to remember his message and his doctrine, he's saying, consider my whole life. The things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, the way you've seen me live, you practice those things and the God of peace will be with you. That is the high and holy standard that every pastor and missionary should pursue. That's one measure of resilience. The second is this. This might be the most important. Resilient pastors know that their work is special, but they always remember that they themselves are ordinary. Again, after 3 generations in this movement, there's very little that you could tell me about it or the people within it that would shock me. Since this is just us, let me be candid. In my younger years, when I was a Bible college student at one of our Bible colleges that no longer exists, frankly, at Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College, I was blessed with some of the greatest, godliest, most humble men to lead me. But I was also subjected to the arrogant preenings, the peacock-like behavior of pastors who treated us as Bible college students as something beneath their time. Those senior pastors, especially if they were senior pastors who took time to listen to us, to involve us, to teach us, to correct us, they were like gold. We realized, even as know-nothing 19-year-old snot-nosed kids, that something had happened in the lives of the men who could not take time to speak to us, who would self-importantly turn aside when they saw us coming. This is a man who has forgotten that his work is vitally, eternally important, but that he himself is not. The way Paul explained it is found in the book of 2 Corinthians. And I know I'm talking to pastors. I'm just reminding you of things that you yourself have read and studied and probably preached many times. Here's what Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. He said, "We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us." The mighty Apostle Paul, when he considered his own life, said, "I'm just a clay pot. I am a jar of clay." And you know, Pastor, that a jar of clay was simple, cheaply made, easily broken, quickly replaceable. It wasn't much more important than a grocery bag is in our own time. But to try to, as an added measure of security, people also often hid very valuable things like jewels and money in these clay jars. And Paul says that's what we're like. We're cheaply made. We're easily broken. We're expendable. We might be destroyed tomorrow. In fact, that's the burden of 2 Corinthians chapter 4. He's telling you just how much he's suffered, how little his human life has been worth. But he says, in this fragile life of ours, we have a great treasure. We have the gospel. A resilient pastor remembers every day of his life that the treasure is the gospel that God has shared with us. That we're just clay pots. We are disposable. We could drop dead tomorrow, and our churches would be pastored perhaps more effectively next week after our funeral than they are today with us at the helm. An ordinary pastor can be a resilient pastor, but the man who starts acting self-important, he's in danger. Resilience, in other words, looks like humility, which C.S. Lewis reminds us is self-forgetfulness. A man who is genuinely resilient is resilient because he's humble. When he's mistreated, he doesn't feel that he's been slighted. He may feel that it's unfair. He may feel that it's untruthful. He may be angered or hurt, but he gets over it more quickly because he remembers the sin that still resides in his own heart, the justice of God that was headed his way, if not for the sacrifice of Jesus. And he remembers that if he got what he really deserved, it would be even worse than his critics say. Such a man is humble. He'll be with it. He can stick with it for the long haul. Fragility looks like self-importance. Those pastors who I'll never forget, that's been 30 years now, but they made an impression. We joked about them in our Bible college dorms that we never wanted to be like those strutting, preening, self-important men. And 30 years later, given a measure of our own success and recognition, given a paycheck and a little bit of a spotlight, that temptation is always calling to all of us. Here's something to keep an eye on. Here's a little idiot light for your dashboard, Pastor. You'll know that you're starting to forget humility and veer into self-importance when you're mistreated, you see yourself as either a victim or you start behaving like a tyrant. Those are the two pathologies. Those are the two sinful reactions of the servant of God when he's mistreated. In one case, he views himself as a victim. Now listen, you may be victimized. In the course of this research, I talked to so many pastors who were so poorly treated by their congregations. Some of them suffered actual threats of death. Some of them were not paid. Others had scandal thrown against them completely baselessly. They were mistreated in ways that in some cases were actually criminal. Such pastors are actually being victimized, but the resilient among them never graduated from being victimized to adopt the victim mentality that sulks. Much more common probably in our ranks. is the pastor who, when mistreated, doesn't choose the sad sack mindset of the victim, but chooses instead the role of the tyrant. He becomes harsh and distant with his staff. He becomes hard to find and hard to talk to. If somebody needs a meeting, he's quick to check to see whether this man or woman actually deserves some of his important time. Such a person who is behaving more like a king than a servant leader, more like a tycoon than a shepherd, is in his own way exposing his fragility of self-importance. The final thing, and I'm done, that I have to share with you, a third thing that resilient pastors know is this. Resilient pastors know to be grateful every day. And here I'd like to give you something that will be immediately useful and absolutely practical, something you can start doing this afternoon to cultivate your own resilience. Because one of the most exciting findings of our research is that just like physical strength and endurance, any human being, including any pastor, can grow more resilient. I'm blessed to be friends as a police chaplain and a friend, a pastor who's surrounded by many good pastoral friends, to know some of the most resilient men alive. They just take the proverbial beating and they keep on going. Here's one of the things that social science has now told us what we always knew, that God always knew the truth and had always put it in his word. Gratitude is not only right, gratitude is good for you. You know that. You preach that to your people, and you're trying to raise your kids with that same encouragement, that they should be grateful in all circumstances, that they should be steadfast in prayer and stick with it with thanksgiving, that they should praise and thank God every day they draw breath. We know that's right. We find that in this Bible. Now, social science has finally caught up to what God has always known to be true. It's not only the right thing to do, it's good for you. Martin Seligman is one of the most cited psychologists in the history of the discipline. He is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he realized after decades of practice that he had gone down the wrong path. He realized, though he doesn't think he was a very effective therapist, if he was, in his view, effective in therapy and he could fix, so-called, all the pathologies that a client brought to him, what he found was not a healthy, thriving person, but an empty person. So he began a new movement called positive psychology that has changed the question of psychology, to change it from not what's wrong with people, but what makes people thrive. And one of his most important research-based findings is that gratitude, surprise, surprise, makes people thrive. He says that the discovery of the intentional practice of gratitude has given him more and better results than 40 years of research and practice did, until he really started drilling down into the very simple idea of gratitude. So here's what you do. Here's your takeaway. We're pastors. We love to give people a takeaway from our little talks, from our sermons. Here's yours. For the rest of this month, we're still in the middle of September. Do this. At the end of every day, in a notebook, write down 3 specific things that you're thankful for, and then take another step and write down also why you are thankful for them. Seligman says to do something like that every day, and he says in many cases this will be more effective than therapy and medication. The simple daily practice of gratitude is highly effective. It improves mood, it increases health, it's very nearly magical. Surprise, surprise, what God put in his word is not only right, but it's effective. So do that for the rest of the month. At the end of the day, think through, review your day, and in all the chaos and in all the tumult and all the angry emails and all the dictates and the strictures put upon you by this pandemic, write down 3 things, great or small, that you were grateful for, and then write down also why you were grateful for them. For instance, you may say, I am grateful that we made budget this month. And I'm grateful for that because it has reminded me that even in these difficult times with their own troubles, our people are grateful, faithful, and generous. You might find that your day has been improved, as mine has, simply by the ability to get outside in good weather. You might be thankful for your child or your spouse. You might be thankful that the car is running well again. It doesn't matter what you come up with, so long as you name some of these things, then you can take it in a spiritual direction that probably has not occurred to Dr. Seligman. With your list, day by day, having made your list, you can then turn to God and take it from the page of a notebook into the presence of the God who loves you so much that he gave you these things and many others to be grateful for. Spend time in prayer then, reviewing your list and thanking him, because these are not coincidences. This is not the way a nameless, faceless universe made your life go. These three things that you've found to be grateful for are actually gifts to you from your Heavenly Father. Resilient men, resilient pastors, servants of all kinds, men and women, have this mindset. They say, I get to. A fragile mindset says something much worse. They say, I have to. Years ago, when we were missionaries in Mexico, I was just swamped with people in the hospital. And visits to a hospital, as you know, are always time-consuming. They are especially so in Mexican public hospitals. It takes a long time. Sometimes it's hard to get in. You need permission or paperwork. It was killing my week, and I had to preach. And these people, heedless of my schedule, with no consideration, kept getting severely ill and getting themselves hospitalized, leaving me none of my precious time to study. And I came home with a furrowed brow and a bad attitude, and my wife, Cherise, said, well, what's going on? Why are you acting this way? And I said, well, Cherise, I've got this and this and this and this, and besides all that, I have to preach. And she took the measure of me and very sweetly said, Bruce, you don't have to preach. You get to. Oh, that stuck with me. She was pointing me back to something good. She was helping me lift my vision beyond duty to gratitude. The conscious practice of that, even when life is falling apart, even in the strain of this pandemic and whatever it's cost you, and we're all grieving something, we've all lost something through this time, the conscious practice of gratitude in these difficult days will change your life. Here's the thing, Pastor. You are resilient. You really are. God made you. And God made resilient people. That's why we're fascinated by movies and stories of people who, even if they don't know God, overcome incredible odds. You have that in you because you're a creation of God. And not only that, you've been redeemed by Jesus. Also, you can grow in resilience. You can be ever more resilient if you will consciously take care of these things. And your godly resilience, Pastor, will be the greatest gift your life can offer all the people around you. A resilient pastor, a resilient father or husband, a resilient friend, a resilient servant in these difficult days will let the light and the light of the gospel of Jesus shine and show the difference that Jesus makes, perhaps more than any sermon you could preach on any given Sunday. I've shared these things with you as a fellow struggler. I started doing this research and I just wrote this book really in self-defense. I went out with an intention not primarily of helping others, but of helping myself because like you, I am determined and I am in great need of serving our great God and running all the way through and hitting the tape running and finishing well. I can. By the grace of God, I can. And by the grace of God, you can too. So be grateful. Remember how ordinary you actually are. And remember to take your whole life into account so that you and I, dear pastor friend, can finish well. God bless you. Thank you for your time today. Go out there and make the resilience that God will work into your life the gift you share with others in these troubled days.